Okay, this video we're going to look at both compression testing and a cylinder leak down test on a gas engine. I put some stuff on the whiteboard here so we can kind of keep track of some of the rules we should be following when we're doing this procedure. First of all, disconnect the ignition so that it's not live at the spark plugs when you're cranking. Second is disconnect the fuel or disable the fuel supply so that we're not pumping gasoline or into the engine while we are cranking. Connect a battery charger. That will keep our cranking speed pretty consistent on a 4-cylinder, right? If you're doing 5 or 4 revolutions for every cylinder, you're basically putting a load on the battery, and we want to be able to keep that battery up so the RPM remains constant for all cylinders. Remove all of the plugs. Don't start by just taking one plug out and putting it back in and then taking the next one out. Remove all the plugs. That will remove the load on the engine, and you're going to be testing them all anyway. Hold the throttle valve open while you are cranking. What we want to have happen is the most amount of air go into that cylinder when it is on the intake stroke, so that my compression ratio will be hopefully higher. Record all of your readings. Don't simply try and go, you're going to memorize them. Write them down so you can look at them and compare them later. Compare them to your specification. What does that engine actually call for? Look for large differences. 2 to 3 drops of oil on cylinders. If you have a cylinder that is exceptionally low, remove your tester, put a couple of drops of oil in, give it 2 or 3 cranks on the ignition. What we're trying to do is spread that oil around the cylinder, then reinstall your hose, redo the test, and what we're going to see is if the pressure comes back up equal to the others, then it might be an indication that the rings in that cylinder are bad. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get some of the stuff ready on the engine, and then we'll have a look at doing that. All right, so now I have my engine set up. I have all of the 4 spark plugs removed from the engine. The spark is disconnected. I've disconnected the plug at the distributor so there's no fire. And I've disconnected the fuel line at the fuel pump, or the connection at the fuel pump, so there's no chance of fuel being pumped into the engine while I'm doing this. Now we have our compression gauge here. It has a quick coupler so that we can remove this and put this into the engine. If your pressure tester is all one hose, and you have, I would suggest you be very careful when you're putting it down and getting it started into the cylinder head. But by having a coupler on, as most of them do now, it simply means every time you can uncouple it and put that into the cylinder head so that you're not running the risk of stripping that thread or cross-threading it on the top. They usually go in pretty quickly. A few turns, you don't have to worry about being exceptionally tight. Reconnect your fitting, all right, and we're going to hold the throttle open, and I'm going to crank the engine until I hear 5 cycles of the engine at that cylinder. All right, it turns over pretty quick. We have about 115 PSI. I'm going to mark that on the board for cylinder number 1. And then we'll go through and do all the other cylinders. Again, it doesn't have to be over tight. Reconnect. Hold your throttle open. About 120. All right, so I've gone ahead and done all 4 cylinders. I just stopped the camera there for a few minutes. All right, so we had 115 PSI on the first cylinder, 120 PSI, 120 PSI, and 110 PSI. Now, that's not a great difference from one cylinder to the next. If I wanted to right now, again, I could go through this and try a couple drops of oil on cylinder number 4, crank it 2 or 3 times, and then retest and see if the pressure comes up to identify whether or not it is the rings that are the problem. But because we are going to do a cylinder leak down test, that will tell me that anyway, all right? Remember, I look at a compression testing as basically looking at the health of the engine. How is it overall? And when we look at a cylinder leak down test, that will be more for a diagnosis. If we're having a problem with a particular cylinder, where is that problem occurring? All right, so here I have the cylinder leak down tester installed, and I have it adjusted to 50 psi on pressure being sent into the cylinder. Now, without somebody here to hold it and keep it from rolling over, what I'm just going to demonstrate is as I put the bar on and turn it up to top dead center, that my pressure on my second gauge has come up to equal to what I have applied on it. So what that's telling me is there's no loss through here. So with that, I'm going to let this back down before it jams my hand. So looking at this for a diagnosis, if I'm losing air in that cylinder, if it is going past the rings, I will hear it in the crankcase, and probably the best place to listen for it is at the oil fill cap. If it is a bad intake valve, I can listen at the intake manifold or with the breather removed into the intake, listen there. And if you hear air leaking, that's an indication of a bad intake valve. Same with the exhaust. Look at the exhaust pipe and see if you hear air there. Now, if it was a head gasket or a crack in the block, couple of things. You may hear a crack in the block or a head gasket at the adjacent cylinder, or you may see it where it's where you pull the radiator cap up, that you see bubbles in the coolant, and that would be an indication that my air is going into my cooling system then as well. Now, another way of looking at that, we can put a tester on and check for carbon dioxide at the top of the cap, or we can simply put a pressure tester on it and run the engine and see if the pressure rises sharply, and that would be an indication that we have a bad head gasket or a crack in somewhere in the head or the block, and it's allowing compression and combustion to travel into that area. All right? So now, once you've completed your test, put everything back together, start the engine, make sure the engine runs, make sure your plugs are in the right hole. You can even inspect the plugs before you put them back in or replace them. Make sure the fuel is connected and the wires to the distributor are connected, and then restart the engine, let it run for a little bit, and make sure that you're not leaving it for somebody else as a mess. So hopefully, if you liked the video, I'm just going to add at the end of this, hit the like button and pass it on to share it with some of the people that you work with.